Yo, 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 what's up, internet? It is Alvin Teaches Poker. And, I've been thinking, when I do videos and I only analyze one hand, that seems to be just a waste of your time and my time, because instead of analyzing one hand over the course of 12 minutes, we can be analyzing 39 hands over the course of an hour. So today, I'm returning to Castle Pluribus, trying to give you that epic content where we are going to go over all of the single raise pots from early position, where Pluribus raises, gets called, and then has to play a pot out of position, either facing a single opponent or facing multiple opponents. So whenever I am trying to get a baseline understanding of a new formation, say if I want to be barreling from under the gun against an in-position opponent, a really good starting point is to look at what kind of bet sizings and strategies really good players, or in this example, Pluribus, are using in a similar formation. So if I really want to bone up on how I want to play my C-bets out of position, well, let's start by studying the very best information available. So let's go ahead and launch this replay. Pluribus opens under the gun to 2x, and we found that Pluribus often is going to be opening to 2x or 2.25x, as we've seen from other videos. We get flatted by Mr. Blue, and yeah, this seems to be a pretty standard flat. You definitely can 3-bet this hand as well, and in terms of GTO, you should be having quite a few hands that mix between 3-betting and flatting here on the button, and generally against, an under-the-gun opponent, you should be, I assume, flatting this a little bit more, and versus the cutoff, you should be 3-betting this a little bit more. And then you get called by pocket threes with Bill, which is pretty standard. I think folding seems to be really criminal facing the min-raise, and then obviously 3-betting is going to be overplaying your hand, especially against Pluribus. So Bill checks, and so now this is a board that really crushes Pluribus's range. So it's going to be interesting to see if, despite having second pair and, a reasonable kicker to, ace high hands, if Pluribus continues here, and now Pluribus checks, and Mr. Blue bets about half pot. Exactly half pot, I mean. Obviously, Bill has a pretty easy laydown here, especially if he assumes that Mr. Blue is going to be pretty balanced with his pre-flop range and have some ace and king type hands here. And then Pluribus just goes ahead and folds. So the first thing to kind of think about is whenever a player bets multi-way, it's up to both players combined to make the minimum defense frequency in order to stifle Mr. Blue from auto-profiting here. So when Mr. Blue bets half the pot here, he needs to get it through, like, what, 1/3 of the time in order to make it a successful bluff? And so Bill and Pluribus, between them, have to come up with that 66% in order to deny the auto-profit, and after Bill folds, that means Pluribus probably has to defend whatever his top 30% of hands, etc., etc. I mean, obviously, this is a very rough estimation of alpha, especially when it's between two players. But for the most part, it says King-Queen here is not going to be in that top 30%, 33%. Again, doing some hand-wavy alpha math. And it finds the fold. Pluribus opens King-9 suited under the gun. And definitely, if you've been watching my videos before, you've seen that solvers, especially for 100 big blinds, really prefer playing King X suited hands more often than, say, I guess, pre-flop strategies did in, 2005. And Bill, again, has a pretty easy flat here with 7-4 suited. Bill starts with a check. And now this is a board that, again, should be really good for the under-the-gun raiser with the ace and the queen, and generally the under-the-gun raiser should be the only person who can have pocket aces, pocket queens, and all combinations of ace-queen here. Though it's also possible Pluribus doesn't have pocket fours here in all of its entirety, although I think Pluribus does actually open a few combinations of pocket fours from under the gun. And Mr. Blue bets half pot. I guess that if you are going to have kind of a bluffing range here, then you definitely are going to want to put 7-8 here, given that you have some kind of backdoors. Obviously, it's going to get called here by Bill, and then Pluribus folds. Now, it's kind of interesting that Bill has this combo draw, and he does not elect to check raise it. One, if he check raises and gets a lot more action from Mr. Blue when it turns a club or rivers a club, then he's actually going to get crushed very often, especially when, you know, when the obvious front door draw gets there, and then you put in a lot of money. Well, your opponent's generally going to try to put you on that front door draw. Also, you need to have some kind of randomization in order to have clubs both in your check calling and in your check raising range, and it seems pretty reasonable that you would put the clubs with some kind of showdown value in your check calling range, and then clubs that have like less showdown value, for example, like King 9 of clubs might be like a check raise here. Bill checks, and then Mr. Blue obviously should give up here when the queen is the absolute worst card. It's going to be really hard to get an ace off a hand. Obviously, the queen's not going to get off a hand. And here Bill bets pretty large on the river. I think if you run this in a solver, it's not going to actually prefer this size. I think the thing is, when everything kind of gets there on the river, it's really hard for your opponent to really call with anything here. You should not have that many bluffs, given that you called out of position to Mr. Blue with Pluribus left to act. So this is kind of a spot where I probably would bet maybe closer to like 450, or about like a third of the pot, or like 40% of the pot, because I just think with like all of my hands, I would prefer to have like a blocker type sizing, right? Like if I had an ace X type hand, I mean an ace X might fall into a check call here, but if I had like a queen, I'd probably want to bet a third. If I had some like better aces, like ace 9 that might want to go for value, or like ace 10 that wants to go for value, then I'd probably want to bet a third and then have that blocker range defended with a couple of like clubs, etc., etc. And then because I have so many value hands that got there, then, you know, all my bluffs are going to be able to just, you know, fire off kind of cheaply there. So I think that is my preferred line. And then, you know, Mr. Blue will have a pretty easy fold. So this is more of a hand between Mr. Bill and Mr. Blue, but it's interesting to see that Pluribus, even on 2 boards that seem to really crush the EP player, has started with checks multi-way. Pluribus raises 8-9 under the gun. Now, if you're playing in a higher rake game, if you're playing with like a 2.5x sizing, I don't think that this is absolutely mandatory, but I think having a couple combinations of the pseudo connectors is not going to be absolutely terrible. So for me, this is going to be a fold, but I might raise a hand, for example, that is like 9-8 of hearts exactly, right? So so this is a board that is not obviously so good for the under the gun player, especially if Pluribus doesn't open all combinations of pocket 2s and pocket 3s, so I imagine this is often going to be a check, even though we do have some backdoors. So I guess, you know, this could probably be a bet some, you know, very small frequency of the time. And then it checks to Mr. Blonde, who bets half pot here. I don't know how I feel about this. I think in general, like, this is going to be a spot where I prefer smaller bet sizings to kind of like keep my opponent's ranges a little bit wider and kind of put them into trickier spots with like middle position, like middle parts of their hands. So like obviously you're never going to get a queen to fold here, and if the opponent has a queen, you're just kind of lighting money on fire when you bet 300 here. I prefer probably like 150 to 220 type range here in order to try to like squeak some value out of like pocket 8s. But I think the problem with betting 300 is that you're just going to get value from stronger hands a little bit too often. Obviously, this is very easy for me to say when I can see all of the cards face up and say that there's a queen there, you know, but I think when you bet 300, you might get like pocket 7s or something to fold a little bit too often. So Mr. Brown calls. Obviously, he's going to start with a check on the turn. And Mr. Blonde checks, especially when now he's turned a lot of equity that really wants to be preserved, right? So this is kind of a spot where if you bet and you get check raised, it's kind of a disaster, right? If your opponent has like pocket 9s or something here, then not realizing the equity here is going to be, you know, a huge, huge mistake. As you can see, Mr. Blonde has 30% against, right, like a queen jack hand with no hearts here, so checks back. Everything kind of gets there on the river. I think some combinations of like Jack 10 are going to check back when the hearts come in. So, yeah, I think this is a spot where this is a pretty reasonable hand putting your check calling range on the river. And Mr. Blonde has showdown equity here, so he can just go ahead and check. I don't think that he has any really incentive to go for kind of like a thin value bet here on the river. And as you can see, because Mr. Brown is checking a queen on the river, right, like it severely disincentivizes Mr. Blonde to do anything from playing anything more than straightforward, because he can get punished by a balanced opponent. Pluribus opens 6s under the gun, which is pretty standard, and Mr. Orange flats on the cutoff. This is a spot where obviously a lot of players play 3-bet or fold, but here in a kind of a no-rake scenario, players are very rarely incentivized, very incentivized to flat in position. So we see ace queen flat, and then pocket fours calls. Checks, Pluribus checks. So now we've seen a bunch of multi-way hands here where almost regardless of the board, Pluribus is starting with a check, right? Obviously these hands are ordered in terms of like how many big blinds you've won or lost. So it does make sense that a lot of the smaller pots that Pluribus loses starts with just like a check flop with a fold. A check fold on the flop. A check flop on the fold. Here Mr. Orange bets a little bit more than a third. I think this is a, I like this bet size here. And Eddie / LinusLove just flats here, which is nice and tricky. And then Pluribus just folds. Now, this is going to be a spot where I think check raising is obviously going to be very, very strong. And so this is this is a pretty dirty spot, because if Mr. Orange is, obviously bluffing at any point, then he's just going to be incentivized to just try to keep firing, and then Eddie is going to appear uncapped here, and then is going to be able to spring a trap later on. Generally, when you slow play on the flop, I expect the trap to be realized on the turn. So if the turn is kind of like a 9 and Mr. Orange bets again, I think Eddie's going to go ahead and put in a check raise. I think it's very rare, especially on pretty draw-heavy boards, where you'll see a player go for a check call, and then check raise the river and allow, Mr. Orange a lot of chances to like realize his draws. So this is a board where I think that Eddie is going to be check raising like 100% of the time on the turn. And then also he should like check raise here with like, like king, jack of clubs, if somehow he can have that on the flop, although he really shouldn't have that often. Mr. Orange overbets, and Eddie just jams. I like this line from Mr. Orange. I think that if he overbets here in the river of blanks, he can go ahead and put in a large bet, and his hand will be good. Also, overbetting here puts just a ton of pressure when the board improves the coordination, when Eddie can have a lot of kind of like medium, like medium type hands here that get improved by like a 10 of clubs, right? Like, jack 9, king 9 of spades, etc. So, a pretty standard fold by Mr. Orange. We know when he overbets and then gets raised, like how often is his hand going to be good there, besides a couple of rare, hands that were improved by the 10. I don't think I said that in the most articulate way, but I think you guys understand what I mean. Pluribus opens under the gun with ace 8, gets flatted by 5-4 here. I mean, this is probably pretty close, and I definitely think that if you just fold this is going to be fine. Get a flat from pocket 8s here, which I think is probably fine. If this was a larger raise size, if this was like 2.5 and this was 2.5, I mean, like, you can flat or 3-bet 8s here. I think either one is going to be pretty reasonable. I mean, 9 seems to be a pretty, super duper squeeze. And Mr. Blue flats here. So we get a nice 4-way pot. And I imagine that Pluribus is going to start with a check here. We've seen that 3-handed it starts with a check very often when it's out of position. I don't think this will be an exception. Okay. I mean, this is definitely one of the hands that you could, you could talk yourself into a bet on the flop because you have so many backdoors, and these seem to be reasonable blockers to a lot of your opponent's calling range. So, but, you have to weigh the fact that I think one of your opponents is going to be able to show up with a queen sometimes. And Eddie checks back. I mean, Eddie has a lot of cards that he wants to hit on the turn, so I like this check back. Again, also really difficult to get, a lot of bluffs through a 4-way pot. Mr. Blue checks again. I think if Mr. Blue has a different queen that wants a little bit more protection, that he should probably put in a bet here. Like king queen seems to be a bet if he did a 3-bet at pre-flop. But I really like checking here with a jack queen, in order to be able to still have a lot of board coverage if the river comes and brings in the straight. Checks through again. Yeah, seems pretty reasonable. And now by the river, everyone checks down. So this is, you know, it's really funny that we talk about, oh man, these high stakes players are going to be playing in the hand so aggressively, and you know, we're playing against the most aggressive GTO opponent with Pluribus, but man, when it comes four-handed, it seems that everyone had to play extremely straightforwardly, and you know, by the river, when the board pairs, it's you know, really hard for Mr. Blue to be able to get any action, so he just goes ahead and checks and, you know, defends his check calling range, and I really like this decision from him. Excuse me. A flat from Mr. Blue in position on the button. This is a hand that definitely is a candidate for 3-betting as well. And then I imagine both these other players are going to fold. Oh, 7-3 defense here. This is probably pretty close. I might just be completely off with what my min-raise defense ranges are here, but yeah, no, I'm sorry. I guess, I think 7-2 might be a fold, but yeah, no, I guess 7-3 can still flop a straight, so you should just call. Talking out of my butt. This is a spot where I personally like check calling here. I think that's probably pretty strong, especially because it's more likely that my other opponents are going to have 5s than I will. And Mr. Blue can definitely have pocket 10s here. But I also wouldn't be surprised if, you know, you actually bet the nut flush here. Starts with a check again, and Mr. Blue checks. Pretty standard. Orange checks, and Pluribus still checks again. Wow. So this is a spot where I think a ton of players are just going to go ahead and take a shot and try to just clear everyone out. And if you did here, it would have actually succeeded. So it's interesting to see if Pluribus would play this as like a check call or like a check raise. Mr. Blue checks again, so we don't get to actually see what Pluribus was planning to do with this versus a bet. But I imagine this would be like kind of a check call type hand. You know, if Mr. Blue has like pocket 7s, he's probably just going to check it down here. So, you know, when he stabs with a hand, it's going to be like King 9 or, you know, Queen 8 or something like that. Or, you know, maybe not Queen 8 because he can't have that pre-flop, but like possibly, you know, Queen 9 of spades or something like that. And now Pluribus has showdown value, so he should just check down. And Mr. Blue checks down too. Makes sense. Another example of, you know, a multi-way pot against these powerful, hyper-aggressive opponents that everyone's like, check, 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 even when Pluribus has enough flush draw. Right, so kind of the most important lesson that we've seen from this first 6 hands is that Pluribus's range multi-way after he starts with a check is extraordinarily defended and has a lot of board coverage. So if you were in Pluribus' shoes and you started with a check call here and Mr. Blue just began barreling off at you and then the river came a heart and he was just like, oh man, this guy can never have the hearts here and jams on you, and then you can be like, nuts. Important. It's important. You know, I was actually talking to, or one of my students was posting about how one of the major differences between playing like 50 no limit zone and 200 no limit zone is when you get up to 200 no limit, people's ranges are a lot more defended in places where you think they're capped. Right, like in 4-bet pots, you're like, this guy never has aces, and he's like, definitely have aces, right? Or there's going to be spots where you barrel off on the guy and he check raises you on the river when you think that he just never can have it. And then so when he check raises you on the river, you're like, is this a bluff? Is this some kind of trap? Like you just are going to get into these weird spots because now you actually have to start guessing instead of just making very accurate reads because guys are going to be uncapped a lot more often than you think. Yep. So Pluribus raises under the gun, and Mr. Pink just goes ahead and folds pocket 4s, which is, I mean, probably fine. I think it's relatively GTO to be folding these, like, okay. That seems to be a term that does not exist, relatively GTO, but I think it's along, there are equilibria near GTO where folding the small pairs here the majority of the time is going to be perfectly fine. Mr. Orange flats. If Mr. Pink is the raiser, Mr. Orange should probably just be 3-betting this 100% of the time. In fact, I mean, I think 3-betting this 100% of the time against the under-the-gun player is probably fine, and then having more of the ace-king offsuit in your flatting range, but, you know, it's not... If it's going to be a mistake here, it's going to be a small mistake. And then Mr. Blue flats behind. Check. Pluribus again starts with a check. And Mr. Orange's hand is, so strong that it can just, obviously wants to both win at showdown and realize its equity with an ace or a king. So starts the check. Mr. Blue still has nothing. Pluribus still has nothing. Okay. So this is also kind of interesting, is that we've also noticed that a couple of times where everything has just checked through, Pluribus is now not taking shots at the turn, right? It seems that it's just continuing to defend its turn checking range here, anticipating that, Mr. Orange will sometimes have some kind of hands that will check back and then defend on the turn at the river. Or bluff on the turn of the river if checked to, right? Again, ace king should check back. And now on the river, everyone just checks through again. This is a terrible board, I think, for Mr. Blue to, suddenly turn his hand into a bluff here. Obviously Queen High is not going to win, but I just don't think that he's going to be able to get it through the remainder of the players at all. So, interesting to see that the big blind is playing very, very straightforwardly and not really trying to steal pots from the two in-position players here. Again, giving Pluribus a lot of credit for being balanced in just a ton of spots. Curiously, Pluribus opens to 225 instead, and it gets flattened in position. It's very standard. Pluribus starts with a check and a board where, in my opinion, Bill can have pocket 4s, pocket 6s, and pocket 10s. And Bill starts with a larger bet, and Pluribus just goes ahead and fold, right? I don't think that this bet is really that necessary, right? This is a board that really, really should crush you. So, I definitely think that you could go for a polarized strategy if you wanted to. You could go for 50 or check here. I'm sorry, 500 or check here. But in general, if you bet the majority of your range for 150 or 200 here, because you have such huge equity advantages on this board after your opponent checks, yeah, that probably is going to be fine. Pluribus opens 4s under the gun. So I think earlier on I said there's a possibility that Pluribus doesn't open 4s, but obviously we see that it does. And Mr. Blue flats this hand, 10-jack on the button. This is probably a hand that you can flat and 3-bet, and generally against the undergun player, you want to be mixing it closer towards a flat. Especially in these no-rake games, right? You're way more incentivized to flat than 3-bet because the amount of money that is in the pot is going to be very, very low, and so there's, the more money that there is in the middle, the more often you want to 3-bet and 4-bet to just take advantage of the dead money. But because all these guys are min-raising, you just want to call and then just see flops, and then defend that calling range with a lot of stronger hands. Pluribus starts with a check, and I imagine Mr. Blue was going to check back this hand here, if I can just make a stab in the dark. I think it's kind of important to have a little bit of board coverage here, and if you had Jack 10 of spades, maybe that this is going to be a bet, but when you have the possibility of being able to catch up with the clubs here, you just suffer from a check raise just slightly more. So I think that in this kind of position, I would personally probably check back spades and diamonds, and then check back clubs and then bet spades and diamonds. Yes, he checks back. Bill leads. I guess Bill is the only player that can really have a 9 here. I mean, Mr. Blue can have some 9s, I guess. From, flatting, he can have a little bit of 8, 9, 9, 10. With some of those hands also probably 3-bet. Pluribus probably should not have that many 9s from his under-the-gun range. Though he might have all of his 9s that he checked on the flop, he'll have on the turn. So, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what do I really think about this bet sizing. I think this is a spot where there's a couple equilibria that are probably going to be fine. It's possible that betting 1,000 here or 1,200 is good. And not just doing that with a 9, but then doing that with a variety of hands. If you genuinely have the advantage of the 9s here, which sounds like a bad Game of Thrones book, it's, you know, you are the one that can always have that like very high value betting size, and then mix that in, mix bluffs into that range in order to be balanced, right? If you don't have that kind of like, you know, pure 9s advantage here, but you should still have, you know, like a lot of 9s, you can probably bet like 250 or like 200 here, and then, you know, to cap your opponent and then like overbet the river. I think that's going to be probably pretty reasonable. And so then you kind of like do that like uncapped, capped game with your opponent. I'm sorry, capped to uncapped game from street to street with your bet sizings, and that kind of like, you know, really messes them up. And I think, you know, in practice, you probably get a lot of value from that with a lot of hands in your range. Gets flatted here. Bill checks. Mr. Blue bets. Oop, Mr. Blue overbets. I mean, I really like this sizing here. I mean, I think the hands that he's trying to really get off are probably going to be like a 9x type hand. You know, like anything less than a queen, obviously. And I think that it's really, really hard for Bill to have a lot of queens here. I mean, like, he should have some queens that, you know, obviously isn't his like checking or check raising range. But, you know, when he checks here on the river, I think a lot of the time he's just kind of like giving up. And obviously Mr. Blue can rep, you know, queens in his check back range. So, I'm trying to think what I think about calling here. And it's probably pretty close, right? Like, I mean, obviously Mr. Blue is going to be checking back some of these kind of bluff hands. I guess it depends on if, you know, what percentage of draws that Mr. Blue is probably checking back the turn with. Obviously, when the 9 comes in on the turn, like, it's not like it's bringing in, you know, any more draws on the turn. So, yeah, I mean, I really like the sizing, especially if you have like a queen here by the river. You know, putting this sizing to a 9 is very good. So, yeah, and Bill calls. I like that call. I mean, it's, you know, hard to full house here. I mean, the problem with it is if you don't check a 9 there, then you're only calling or check raising the river with like the top full house. So probably just like get run over a little bit. Pluribus raises and Mr. Blue flats in position with aces, like a sneaky devil. Pluribus starts with a check on a board where definitely Mr. Blue can have like jacks and 9s. And Mr. Blue checks back, which is incredibly strong when you have top set here, obviously. Pluribus checks again, and Mr. Blue now is kind of forced to put in a bet, especially when the board and coordination is improved. And, you know, now Pluribus should have much more of a check calling range when a lot more kind of like draws and middling hands come in, like, you know, king queen, you know, jack queen, etc. I'm sorry, not jack queen, jack 10, etc. But, you know, Pluribus just folds. So not too much to learn here, but interesting to see that, you know, tricky Mr. Blue occasionally is flatting the min raise, hoping to kind of induce a raise from all of the remaining human players, right? And we were just talking about how very strong players can, you know, just be a little bit more uncapped than you suspect in every position. Here, you know, like this is a spot where you should pretty much never put Mr. Blue on aces, and yet here, if you try to put it all in, he'll just be like top set. And remember, this is not, you know, just to exploit Pluribus. This is also to exploit the, you know, the players behind who, you know, happen to fold this hand. Pluribus raises. Again with a slightly larger bet sizing. And again, Mr. Blue flats with ace-king. I think I mentioned earlier that really prefer the offsuit instead of the suited hands here, but, you know, neither here nor there with this rake structure. Everyone checks through again. I imagine this is going to be there's going to be a lot of turns where Eddie is going to try to take a stab here. That might not be one of them because he wants to check and just kind of defend his, you know, queen defending range. Also, when you have a 10 or a jack, it gives you a little bit more board coverage for all of the straights. So I think Eddie's going to check here. Yes. Pluribus checks again, and Mr. Blue, obviously with ace-king, is probably just going to want to try to show down, I think. Checks again. Cool. Now on the river, Eddie can probably bet. Still checks and defends here. Pluribus checks, and then Mr. Blue now checks down. So Eddie is, once again, surprisingly trying to show up with a surprisingly strong hand here. If anyone, just in case either Pluribus or Mr. Blue wants to take a shot, but neither Pluribus or Mr. Blue are very incentivized to want to bluff when they have like relatively strong aces. Pluribus raises 4s under the gun. I think there are hands again where 4s is just folded, but or maybe it's only 2s and 3s that fold under the gun. I think that's what I'm actually mistaking. Again, a board that should generally crush Pluribus. Pluribus' opening range. And he starts with the check. Pluribus checks, and I think Mr. Blue's going to just check with a pair. Cool. 8s. Gonna check. I think the pattern that we've seen is that everyone, when they have showdown values, is going to probably play pretty straightforwardly here. No real reason for Eddie to go for a river bet here, in my opinion. Neither should Pluribus, and Mr. Blue should just show down 7s in hopes that everyone else has like 6s and 2s. Yep, cool. So GTOs for when you have these pairs that everyone's just checking down. Seems to just be just trying to show down your hand. So that seems to be pretty easy. But in case that you are the kind of person who is occasionally betting with 7s here, hoping to like quote unquote protect your hand, yeah, it's probably just going to be burning money, especially when there is some slight possibility that your opponents are going to be checking like pocket jacks that might call once on the river, or like queen x that might call on the river. Ooh, a 2.5 raise from Pluribus, getting spicy here. Gets flattered by 7s under the gun, and I expect everyone else to fold. We'll check. Mr. White bets near pot, and Pluribus just folds. So not really much to say about this, especially on a board that allows for a possible straight. There's just a lot more combinations of proportional nuts in Mr. White ranges than Pluribus, so I think it's gonna check a decent amount of the time. Okay, so it looks like now we're getting into like the 2.5 raises. Get another 3-way pot, and with an overpair, Pluribus starts with check. Again, defending this range here. And it's interesting to see if Pluribus would go for like a check raise or a check call here. I think it'll go for a check raise with some frequency here, especially because I don't think that Mr. Orange should have that many 2s in his pre-flop flatting range. Mr. Orange checks. Blue leads out with an overbet here. I mean, there shouldn't be too many king x's in Mr. Orange's range. There definitely should be some x's in king x's in Pluribus's range. This is just an interesting bet size. I'm not really too sure what I think about it. I do think, rather than looking at Mr. Blue's exact hand, the argument you can make for this is, of these 3 players, the big blind min-raise flatter pre-flop is the guy who should have the most 2s. Right? Mr. Blue can have like 10-2, 9-2, 8-2, right, etc., while Pluribus and Mr. Orange can't have any of those hands. So I think that this could be a pretty good argument for putting in an overbet here. And he just goes ahead and gets Mr. Orange to fold. So wow. I don't like that fold. I think if you're folding a king x here, then you're just not calling anything except the checked back 2. Right, so you have to at least call here and then kind of play poker on the river. So, well played by Mr. Blue. I think that is what the correct justification is that you should realize that you have the 2x equity advantage there, or the nuts advantage. What is this? Pluribus opens 3.5 under the gun, which we have not seen at all, and I don't really remember even seeing this before. So now Mr. Blue definitely is going to be flatting, simply seeing this very, rare bet size. Although maybe I guess we might see this a lot more commonly as we keep going. But it's interesting that in a no-rake game, Pluribus is mixing everything between 2 and 3.5. I imagine that the 3.5 is going to have ace-10 in the minority range. It's going to be probably like more ace-king and ace-king heavy here. And Mr. Pink flats. Checks. Mr. Pluribus checks again. And now Mr. Blue bets a little bit less than half of the pot. It's like 40% of the pot. I really like this kind of bet sizing. Definitely is going to make your opponent's life kind of very difficult if he has like ace-king or like ace-9 with the ace of hearts. right, like is kind of put into like a gross spot. Like ace-7 with the ace of hearts is just like kind of vomiting because facing the size, like he's just folding a lot of equity when he folds those kind of hands. Also, if you have an 8x type hand, it makes your life pretty easy if you just like pot it here, right? And then your opponent can probably just fold like queen 8 on the flop. So like when you bet like 40% here, definitely is going to put Mr. Pink in a spot like on future streets. This is probably a really, really bad turn for Mr. Blue, and I wouldn't be surprised if he checked back here and tried to set a trap on the river. Continues to bet. That's, also very fine. He gets jammed on by Mr. Pink. Wow, that's pretty gross. I think this is what do I think about this? I think this is a spot where after Pluribus raises 3.5 under the gun and Mr. Blue flats, and then he bets twice, that you could put a lot of arguments for saying that an 8x type hand here does not have any showdown value, in which case then it's good to turn this hand into a bluff here. But if you do think that you have showdown value here, then there's a lot of merit in putting this hand in your check calling range to give yourself some kind of board coverage by the river. So I think that is the analysis in the moment, is if you don't think you have showdown value, turning your hand into a bluff here is good. If you do think you have showdown value, then calling here, intending to play rivers, is going to be superior. So I think Mr. Pink play is probably good as a call or a check raise, and gets Mr. Blue off a hand. So this is, monster status here. And so if he's correctly analyzing that Mr. Blue's only going to be playing this kind of bet sizing when he has either like 9s, 10s, jacks, etc., and might be able to fold those hands, then this is really strong. Now Pluribus min raises under the gun. Tricky demon. Mr. Blue flats again. And I imagine Pluribus is going to start with a check here because Mr. Blue probably should have more 9s than Pluribus has, proportionally. And Mr. Blue checks back. Again, right, Mr. Blue, if he had a hand like Jack 10 of clubs, I think he'd be a little bit more incentivized to bet here. But when he has clear showdown value, checking back and then trying to realize a lot of those equity percentages is really good. I almost said percentile, which is definitely not the plural to percentages. Wow, Pluribus checks again. So tricky. Mr. Blue checks again, still trying to just play its hand as its showdown value. And wow, Pluribus checks the river, and Mr. Blue checks the river. So sneaky here, and definitely Pluribus is trying to play this hand as like a check raise on the turn and the river here. So I really, really like that Pluribus is just constantly thinking about how defended is it after it checks both the flop and the turn. And this seems to be a spot where if you are going to, right, like really put Pluribus in a spot, and if you're going to put Pluribus on a range that definitely can't have a calling down or check raise turn bet river for value, then you're going to be paying off or bluffing in spots where you really shouldn't against kind of a GTO opponent. So wow, really devious by Pluribus. And in this particular hand, however, it does lose a ton of value against Mr. Blue's hand. So, but again, we don't look at poker in hand by hand scenarios. We look at them by range. Threes is probably pretty close, especially when Pluribus is sizing up a little bit. Again, this is a no-rake structure, so if flatting with your pocket pairs a little bit more often than what is quote-unquote standard is probably going to be fine. But if you folded this hand, again, I don't think that's like a huge mistake. You should be more likely to flat this on the button than you would in the cutoff. Okay, so this is a board that crushes Pluribus's range. He's got blockers. He has one pair. But rather than play his hand as a check call with the 10, it's just going ahead and betting here. Now, this might be a hand that it often check calls, and I imagine that it would check call with some frequency here. But it's interesting to see that when it does bet, it's starting with a half pot frequency. So let's kind of take note of this and see how much of this is going to continue from hand to hand. Threes is obviously going to be a fold, right? Yeah, cool. So Pluribus raises another gun again. And this is a board that is pretty mediocre to continuation bet. Pluribus starts with a check. And checks again. Probably puts this in a check calling range depending if the size is, you know, small enough. Mr. White just checks again, tries to get a showdown. And now Pluribus goes ahead and pots the river. This is kind of interesting. I'm not really sure what it is about the 6 that has Pluribus suddenly turning its hand into a bluff. Maybe it thinks that enough small pairs have gotten there that now Mr. White has some kind of like showdown value type hands that need to actually be bluffed off, and the Ace King is suddenly no good, right? Like, I guess it evaluated that Ace King has enough showdown value on the Queen of the 10, but somehow when this river gets there, it's better to turn its hand into a bluff. Maybe it just has some kind of hands in its like checking, its double checking range that is going to be surprisingly powerful on the river. You know, this is one of the big problems about looking at how to play hands in a vacuum, is that it's really hard to see if this is good without seeing the rest of its strategy here. So this is going to be hard to evaluate, but it is interesting to see that it's suddenly deciding, oh, this is just not a showdown hand anymore. This is going to be a hand where I should just go for it. Pretty standard pre-flop play. And I imagine Pluribus is going to start with a check again here, and then just defend its checking range. Yep, starts with a check. And Mr. Orange now is going to fall into the trap of putting in money, while Pluribus is going to be extremely, extremely well defended. Pluribus calls. Checks. Mr. Orange should now definitely check when he hits a heart and can somehow get there on the river. And Pluribus just checks, and Mr. Orange checks back. So definitely by playing its hand so slow, you know, Mr. Pluribus lets Mr. Orange get there, but by playing it slow on the flop, he also is getting Mr. Orange to put in a third of the pot on the flop with, I mean, you know, no real way to improve unless he hits runner or a set. Pluribus raises a very strange size with aces here. This is just really, really interesting to see that it's just like really, really randomizing its pre-flop kind of play. Hits aces, starts with a check. Mr. Orange checks. Checks again, which I think is, you know, going to be very good and very trappy when you block everything. It's just, you know, really incentivizes you to check and let your opponent just take stabs at you. Mr. Orange is going to check here. And I imagine Pluribus is just going to check and just put this into a check-raise trap on the river. Yeah, just checks on the river, and Mr. Orange is just going to check back. So, I mean, there's not that much value to be had from this hand. I mean, even if you bet the flop, you might get a fold. If you bet the turn, you might get a fold. Right? If you bet the river, nah. I mean, I think at this point, Mr. Orange might see that Pluribus is defended enough in the spot that I can show up on the river with a lot of different, like, queen or ace-x type hands if it does try to bet there. So, no value for top set, but, you know, definitely putting the fear in everyone when they think that when Pluribus checks to them multiple times that they can just like indiscriminately bluff. And that's something that when you're playing against very bad players is a very clear sign, right? When a guy checks to you 3 times, that guy's overfolding like crazy, but Pluribus is definitely not going to be overfolding that much. Again, we see multiple checks, and now it's going to be interesting to see if Pluribus checks this again. I think that because the jack does improve a lot of other hands, we're going to be seeing a bet from Pluribus, but it's going to be interesting to see what bet sizing it's going to use. If it checks here again, I'm going to be dazzled. Oh, it checks here again. So sneaky. So it's kind of interesting to see that Pluribus, again, is playing hyper-defended, double-checking ranges like in multi-way pots. Now Pluribus just pots it on the river, trying to just maximize, I guess, against, like, you know, some kind of, like, slow-played queen, some kind of slow-played king. But, you know, not going to get any action here. What is very interesting is when you are playing against the machine and it is uncapped in a lot of spots, it forces everyone else to play pretty straightforwardly, lest they run into your traps. So, you know, if you're playing against really aggressive opponents, it's probably an indication that, you know, they're going to be spewing tons of money against you if you are being surprisingly uncapped, and they're just going to keep blasting. Pluribus starts with a check. I imagine Mr. Blue is going to be checking back some of the lower hearts here in order to have some kind of board coverage. But, you know, when you have 3 high, you're also very incentivized to bet the flop. But also, you know, I think there should be more kings and Pluribus's under the gun range proportionally than there should be in Mr. Blue's range. So I'm going to predict this is going to be a check, but yeah, I think there should be a little bit of betting, again, because you have 3 high. So let's check. Pluribus goes ahead and bets, ooh, a small bet here on the turn after it checks through. So again, kind of hard to evaluate this in a vacuum, right? Like, obviously, when you can see the entire strategy of what bet sizing is going to be used, this is a lot more interesting. But it's going to be a spot where I bet there's going to be a lot of like quarter bets or third bets here on the turn. And then when you get to the river and you have like a lot of like hearts, or I'm sorry, not hearts, when you have a lot of like blanks and you have like a king X type hand, Pluribus is going to be putting in the overbet and putting you in kind of like a really, really gross spot after you, you know, checking the flop and you check back, essentially capping your range. Mr. Blue flats again. So Mr. Blue definitely is, you know, trying to play a lot of pots in position with Pluribus. Again, this is going to be a board that really, really crushes Pluribus, but I imagine with such a strong hand, especially when you unblock top pair, that this is going to be a bet on the flop. But, you know, Pluribus has surprised me multiple times. Oh my god, still a check! So these are some boards that, again, are just so crushing for the under the gun player, but Pluribus is just defending its checking range so often, right? I mean, Mr. Blue can have all 4 combinations of, like, straights here. Well, he probably can't have all 4. I mean, he probably has like 3. He might 3-bet, you know, 1 combination of jacks and suited more often here. But starts with a check, and Mr. Blue checks back because obviously he's got, you know, one of his weaker aces. Despite the turn bringing in so many draws, Pluribus bets really small, and I think this is going to be a spot where Blue is just going to be very, very happy to take a showdown value and just call this 1/4 bet rather than put in a raise and, you know, try to get it get into fanciness with a heart. So there we go. And then this Pluribus is going to go for like 1,800 here. Oh, it goes even bigger. Goes for 3 times overbet on the flop, which I really, really like with, you know, different parts of your range here, because now this is going to put Mr. Blue into some kind of like really, really weird spot. So it seems to me, just offhandedly, Mr. Pluribus, I almost said, Pluribus is starting by checking a lot of hands on the flop, being really, really uncapped. But because he is so uncapped by the river, then he is now going to be leveraging it by putting in an overbet. So this is a spot where I instinctively said like 1,800, but it seems like, you know, Pluribus goes for intense greed. You know, obviously hard to predict the exact bet sizing that the computer is going to be using when it's using, you know, an overbet sizing, but pretty interesting. And Mr. Blue finds a fold, which I think is going to be very, very reasonable here, given that, you know, again, the board is so good for the under the gun player. But then that also means that if you have, you know, whatever kind of bluffs that ran out here, like if maybe you have hearts that ran out here, and then you wanted to just put in this blast on the river, you're still going to be able to get a 1-pair hand to fold, right? So easy to see that you overbet here when you have a king, but it's much less easy to see when you overbet here when you have, say, like Queen 10, which might be a good candidate to like bet this size as well and try to get your opponent off a hand. Pluribus starts with a check. Okay. Again, defending its range, giving itself tons of board coverage across a lot of different overcards, which I really like. That's where he bets. Well, I wonder if this is going to be a check raise hand. I think if you check raise this hand and they get like shipped on, you just hate your gut so much that this might just be a check call. Yeah, it's just a check call. Okay. Good to know. Get the coverage there. And Pluribus goes ahead and leads. Again, you know, the perpetual problem is can't really evaluate this without evaluating all of the other parts of this range, so it's really interesting to see if Pluribus is going to be also betting, you know, hands like hearts here, right? Like, if he's betting a quarter here, he has to be doing it with other hands that are going to be protected in order to prevent this range from just getting blown up when Hattori raises and then shoves the river. So there has to be some kind of combinations of the nuts here. I think like ace-2 of hearts might be a combination of like the nut flush draw that like check calls the flop and then can lead the turn. This also is probably just a turn that is going to just get Hattori to just check back so often when he has a hand like, you know, pocket kings or something, that leading here for a little bit of value is going to be worthwhile. Again, this is based on whatever Pluribus's evaluation of both players' exact ranges are, so it's going to be hard to tell, because obviously when two GTO opponents are playing against each other, everything is very blocker-centric. But interesting to note, again, when the turn is like the worst card for the in-position player, the out-of-position player is going to be leading. Similarly, if this turn was like the 9 of clubs, I think that Pluribus should have a leading range here, right? Or the 10 of clubs as well. And Hattori finds an easy fold. Pluribus going for its kind of mixed sizings. And Mr. Blue defends. I mean, pretty wide here, but it's not, you know, again, it's not going to be like a huge mistake ever. Mr. Blue checks. Pluribus, bets half pot into 2 players here. Now, this might be a spot where Pluribus is thinking Eddie is not going to have pocket 2s or pocket 5s that often because he's opening from under the gun, although, you know, Eddie should have a little bit of pocket 5s in my opinion. So it might be a little bit more clear to just go ahead and bet this texture, but I think this also is just going to be a check the majority of the time, and this is probably just a minority play. And so again, you know, can't pay attention to the individual hand. Eddie with 3 backdoors goes ahead and floats, which I like. And then Mr. Blue tries to get sneaky there, thinking that Eddie's never going to have a 2 here after he just floats the flop, and then Pluribus can't have that many 2s here, so he thinks his 2s and 9s might possibly be clean. Checks. I imagine now that Eddie has improved his hand, he's going to want to check back and then realize that equity, because it's kind of a disaster if he bets and gets check raised. So he checks. Now he gets there. Mr. Blue checks, Pluribus checks, and then not much value to be had 3 ways from Eddie, right? Like if he bets, he's just going to get a chop very often, or Mr. Blue's just going to show, like, check raise a 6. So he checks there. So I think this is a well-played hand from all of these players. Pluribus opens, Mr. Blue flats. We notice that Mr. Blue loves flatting in position against Pluribus. I mean, obviously we're looking at single raise pots, but, you know, we see a lot of these hands. And Mr. Pink overcalls here with, you know, kind of a garbage hand. With a gut shot on the flop and a backdoor, I mean, this is definitely going to be a candidate hand to c-bet on the flop if you are going to c-bet at all. Especially because, again, we don't always think that Mr. Blue is going to have all the combinations of pocket 5s, pocket 3s, and pocket 9s. He might fold a couple of the pocket 3s pre-flop. Actually, no. He might have a lot of 5s and 9s here now that I think about it more. But, you know, this if you have any kind of flop bluffing range, then this is one of those hands that you can put into there. Those are the check. And Mr. Blue with kind of like nothing in overcards and backdoors, just kind of fires. He gets peeled by a single pair here. It's pretty close from Mr. Pink. I mean, Mr. Pink definitely always wants to, you know, prefer calling when he has the ace here, because it's going to be blocking a lot of Mr. Blue's like triple barrels or like, you know, subsequent barrels here. And Pluribus flats with the gut shot over and backdoor clubs. So definitely was going for a kind of more coverage type play here. And now you see, you know, how you can see already how a lot of these coverage plays are very important, because when you put a lot of hands in your check calling range, you know, when the backdoors get there, your opponents are going to be really flabbergasted. So Mr. Pink checks. I really like Mr. Pink's check here because, you know, I mean, like, a lot of his hands should not be really happy that an ace rolled off with these 2 players left to act. So, you know, starting with a check here and putting your hand into like a check call or check raising range seems to be very reasonable. Especially if Mr. Blue bets the river, I think Mr. Pink should check raise him a lot. Pluribus checks, and I think Mr. Blue's going to check back here, especially when he has clubs. So I like Mr. Pink's river check. I know we were supposed to be talking about, like, you know, Pluribus's flop strategy, but very often these hands have, you know, kind of devolved into talking about other hands. This is going to be another spot where I think that Pluribus can bet, like, a minority of the time, but very often I think starting with a check here and kind of go for it, and trying to go for some kind of, you know, board coverage is going to be fine. So with the check, O-Ren bets 400 into 550, right? Like, you know, you're very much at the top of your range. Your opponent starts with a check. You know, I think that you should be betting here, and I like polarizing and sizing up rather than going for like a smaller bet sizing when the under the gun player checks an ace high flop to you. Starts with the call. Pluribus checks. I imagine O-Ren's just gonna bet like 1100 here, 1400. Woo! Goes for the larger bet sizing, even on the turn dry. I mean, you know, obviously any kind of larger on the larger sizing is going to be good here. I think the biggest mistake you could possibly make is probably just going for like 500 or 600 here. So, and Pluribus just kind of goes for the fold. So that's fine. Goes for the fold. A strange saying. Pretty standard from everyone, and Mr. Blue definitely is incentivized to, you know, call 4 ways with almost any 2 cards here, or any 2 like, you know, middle-ish cards. Pluribus starts with a check, and I imagine that it's going to be a check call. I'm sorry, not a check call, like a check fold, depending on how much Bud bets here, or how much action that he's going to be getting. If there's like a bet and a call, it might consider like calling, trying to like get to the 5 here, but I think that just, you know, facing like 700, Pluribus might just fold this on the flop, especially, you know, multi-way. But in position bets 350 into 1,000. I really like this bet size. Kind of, you know, definitely going to put Hattori into like a really, really like gross spot. Hattori calls. And then, yeah, and then Pluribus is definitely going to overcall here, especially thinking the 5 is going to be live. Checks. Should Pluribus have a leading range on 4x? I definitely think that Bud should not have that many 4x. Hattori should not have that many 4x from the pre-flop action. Bud probably is not betting that many 4x on the flop. Hattori is probably folding 4x on the flop and then defending like higher hands like 10s and jacks. Like pocket 10s and, you know, jack x, I mean. So, I mean, I think that in theory, Pluribus should be the only player who has like 4s here. But then how many 4s does Pluribus have from under the gun? So I think, you know, if you're kind of sitting there at home trying to do the math problem, that's really what you should be thinking about here, is like who has the most 4s here. And like from the action, I think Pluribus is the most 4 heavy player, assuming again if he had enough 4x's in his pre-flop range, and that's going to be pretty dubious because you're probably not opening 5-4 from under the gun here. So yeah, that's kind of a spot where no one really has that many 4s, and so maybe Pluribus should just continue to check here. Again, if Pluribus had proportionally more 4s here, should probably lead like 500. I definitely understand why Bud is checking here, but I think now that we've just talked through all of that and talked through, you know, who's going to have more 4s here, just going ahead and betting like 1,200 or 1,500 is going to be fine here. Pluribus checks. Go for it, Bud. Don't be scared. Oh, he checks through. I think, I mean, what do I know, right? Maybe these guys have a lot more 4x's here, but I think that you can just try to squeak a little bit more value here. Yeah, that's probably fine by Bill. Pluribus bets here instead of checking. Especially because this is a paired board. I think this is a spot where Pluribus should be considering checking a lot. But obviously, because it's the robot, it doesn't do any kind of like mass simplification. It's going to have some bets in his range. And then with, you know, reasonable backdoors, Mr. Blonde floats. Check, and Mr. Blonde should check because he's going to realize his showdown value. I think that there should be a smaller bet sizing here. I think that Pluribus should go for like closer to like 330 or 400 though here. Though, if you ever overbet here when you have the nuts, I mean, that's like never going to be a huge mistake, right? I simply think that Pluribus should have like, you know, a reasonable amount of hands that like... I think Pluribus should have a reasonable amount of hands that just want to have like a blocker or like smaller value size here. But, you know, again, when you have the nuts and you go for an overbet, it's just never going to be a huge mistake. So, or it's never going to be a mistake at all. So there's multiple different strategies that you can use there, and obviously it depends on whatever kind of like presets that Pluribus has. Mr. Pink checks, Pluribus checks, yeah. Mr. Blue checks. Oh, Mr. Blue bets and tries to defend his hand a little bit, and ooh, spicy. Again, I'm going to start saying this for a ton of hands. Hard to evaluate how good this hand is in a vacuum. Obviously, Pluribus should be having the, you know, the majority of the ace-king and like king-queen type hands here, if assuming that Mr. Blue 3-bets those hands with kind of any frequency. And so occasionally just putting in a check raise if you have like pocket 2s, pocket 5s, I guess, pocket, you know, 4s, maybe a 3x, and then maybe a hand like, you know, 10-9 of diamonds is probably going to be pretty reasonable here. So hard to say if I really like this play, but it's definitely really dirty when you can see that Mr. Blue has pocket 6s. And so this is good. That hand was probably one of those spots where, because Mr. Blue is just, because Pluribus is so uncapped when he checks to you, then it can add in some of those bluffs there, and you know, you have to really give it respect. So checks, Pluribus, bets. I mean, I don't think that this bet's going to get through very often, to be honest. But again, you know, Pluribus doesn't play any simplified strategies, and you know, it's going to be putting in a half pot bet with some kind of frequency here. But I think this is probably also going to be the majority check. I wish I had the Pluribus log so I could just be like, oh yeah, this is good, this is bad, right? Obviously not going to get that hand off. And, okay. So Pluribus now is just going to go ahead and put this into its just like bluffing off range and then just trying to go for its blocker properties. And so now, you know, Mr. Pink's going to be put into a pretty gross position. This is a technique that Pluribus and Linus use that I really, really think are important, is that even in multi-way pots, they'll bet like small and then overbet turn. Right? I think that's a strategy that a lot of people are getting more familiar with in heads-up pots, even though that, you know, when I say more familiar, I mean, that's a pretty esoteric strategy still for a lot of players who don't understand game theory very well. But being willing to also go for these overbets in, like, multi-way situations when they then turn heads up on a future street is very, very interesting. So, you know, big balls here. Big machine balls. Pretty standard for everyone. Pluribus is going to start with a check, as it almost always does, and everyone's just going to check through. So again, I really, really like that Mr. Blue shows up with tons of hands, right? Like, he can have now hearts on the turns, he can have overcards on the turns. This guy probably can have, like, pocket 7s with, or pocket jacks with, like, a small frequency on the turn, right? Like, Mr. Blue has just demonstrated hand over hand that he definitely can have a lot of coverage. Right, so you're just not going to be able to run him over on a lot of streets. Wow. I mean, I guess Mr. Orange is definitely going to be at the bottom of his range in terms of having 9 high here, and then he has a hand that has, you know, a reasonable equity, and he has a single heart. So this is a nice play, right? I like that he picked a very large bet sizing. It's going to probably put pressure on a lot of Pluribus's hands that are like, even like pocket kings here or pocket queens that check the flop and check through are not going to be thrilled when you face a bet of this size. And we've seen in like some different spots where, the board is not like very, very good for pocket aces when it's like 3 or 4 ways that even to like a pot size bet on the flop, like it's willing to fold pocket aces multi-way. Anyway, I mean, in terms of like what sometimes Snowy will do on these kind of like low boards when you have overpairs. So I definitely like the size, because if you had like pocket sevens, etc. in this, you know, if Pluribus had kings, you know, you'd want to put in this size against him. And then everyone calls. So definitely didn't see this hand beforehand, because, you know, obviously I would have then said, oh, this is a terrible bet, because everyone's going to call you in position. But yeah, I do like this sizing, because I think Mr. Orange can have, you know, like all of the hands on this board, except pocket jacks, obviously. Now, woo! Goes for it on the river. What are you trying to represent here? Exactly, like 6-8? There's not that many hands that he represents here. I think he is right in the fact that it's going to be pretty hard for anyone to have ace-3 here. I mean, Mr. Orange's betting, like, bluffing frequency here should be, like, very, very small. But, like, I guess there has to be a little bit of bluffs, considering the fact that he should be able to have some straights here. Like, I mean, from the big blind, you're the guy who should be able to have weird straights more often than anyone else, right? Like, he's allowed to have 3-6. He's allowed to have 6-4 much more often than any of the other players. And so I think that is mainly what he should be trying to represent here, right? Like, I mean, like, Mr. Blue can have pretty much all of the same combinations. Actually, no, Mr. Blue can't even have as many combinations of 2 pairs Mr. Orange has, because Mr. Orange can have, like, 2-4, right? Like, he can have, like, all of the really, really weird stuff, even though, I don't know if 2-4 bets on the river? I mean, 2-4 might not even bet the turn, right? But, like, 2-4 might not be terrible to, like, turn into a bluff, intending to turn it into a bluff on some blanks. So, yeah, this is kind of a complex hand. But I do really like Mr. Orange's idea to bet the turn, intending to fire on good rivers to him. Like, as long as you're following through on the river, then it becomes much stronger. Wow, gets it through. That's really, really dirty. So, good job, Mr. Orange, pulling the trigger multi-way. I mean, of all the hands we've seen, this actually might be the hand of the night so far. Because I do really think that if you think deeply about this, Mr. Orange is going to be the one who has the most combinations of nuts by the time you get to the river. And I really think that theoretically this hand falls into into the criteria of what you need to be having to bet the turn. Right? You have the open-ended straight draw, you have a blocker to the heart, and you have 9 high. Right? So really, really like this play. Very impressed. Big baller, never lost. Wow, Queen Jack offsuit, getting kind of loose here. Eddie / Linus flats in position, and again, I don't know if Eddie is Linus for sure, but having watched Eddie a lot of Eddie's hands, it seems like he is the most Linus-like player here. Although obviously we've seen a lot of like GTO type mastery from Mr. Blue as well. Mr. Blue checks. Pluribus starts with a range check. Eddie checks, trying to realize his double back doors. This is again a spot where Mr. Blue, as the min-raise big blind, should have the most 2s here, especially when Pluribus opened from under the gun. So this is probably not a terrible spot, especially when you have a 9 as well, to put in an overbet. So I think a 900 for Mr. Blue is probably not terrible. It goes for 500. Okay. So still along those lines, right? Like, he should have the 2s here. Ooh, Pluribus floats just with the naked gutshot and overs. And then he takes it off Mr. Blue. I like it. I mean, that seems like it to be a pretty loose call with Eddie behind, right? But it's definitely, again, saying Eddie's not going to have that much 2x here. That's a board where if the big blind had overbet, he probably would have won the hand. Mr. Blue flats. Bill flats. Bill checks. Pluribus checks. And Blue checks, right? Again, this is a hand, especially when you have the backdoor diamonds, wants to realize a ton of equity. And you see again and again how many of these hands where that backdoor equity is coming into play. They'll just goes ahead and blasts, gets called by two players in position, and I think this is just not a good play. I would just probably just give up from Bill's shoes. Pluribus turns its hand into a bluff here. Again, you can tell from my in the moment reaction, in the moment analysis. I mean, the fours obviously don't have any showdown value by the river when the diamonds come in. I guess Pluribus is just saying that, it is going to be more uncapped here and should have more diamonds than any other player here, and is being a little bit bamboozled by Mr. Blue, obviously in this hand. But I think what this means in general is that Pluribus is saying that it is going to be the most uncapped player by the time it gets to the river, according to the action, when the ace comes off. Mr. Blue just flats. On this paired board, I don't think there's any, too much reason to raise, especially with a player left to act. Makes a lot of sense. And Bill folds, right? Obviously, if this was not a paired board, Pluribus could be raised here, because you have the nuts. But on paired boards, it's very interesting that, even with the nut flush, giving tons of respect to full houses. Mr. Blue checks, Pluribus checks. Mr. Orange is, almost has to put in a bet. The question is kind of what sizing here. I think Mr. Orange should not have that many threes. Mr. Blue should have almost all of the threes, so maybe an overbet is not going to be the best sizing here. So I think anything between 200 and 500 is going to be reasonable. Checks back. Wow, goes for that juicy board coverage here. I think I would just bet jacks normally. Mr. Blue checks, Pluribus checks. Ooh. Obviously if your opponent has, overcards to the board that are undercards to your pair, then checking back jacks is, super, super amazing here to let Pluribus catch up and then check raise the turn. Woo! So, we've definitely seen that Pluribus goes for that, that double protected checking range on the turn, but it's now really interesting to see that it goes ahead and check raises a hand as weak as Queen 10. On the river it checks, and then Mr. Orange probably is just going to be checking back here. So I wonder what Pluribus would do if the river was just a blank. If it was a 2, if it was a 9, right? Would Pluribus put this hand into its check calling range, or would it bet the river? I imagine it would probably put Queen 10 into its check calling range, and then put stronger hands into its river betting range. I wonder what would happen here if this king was then a spade as well with Pluribus. I imagine Pluribus would check call this hand, and then put stronger hands into its check raise turn shove river range. Very interesting to see how protected that is. And occasionally it'll just take shots with hands that, again, don't necessarily seem that intuitive. That probably isn't going to be a minority play, I imagine, but one thing that is kind of important, again, for board coverage is that if you're never check raising that hand, then you can never have trips on the river. You can't check raise there, then bet the river and have trips. So you have to have a little bit of 10x in that kind of check raising range. So Eddie starts with a check. I imagine Pluribus is going to check this hand very often, especially with the board being paired and it has some showdown value. Mr. Blue checks. Eddie checks on a turn where he has a really strong combo draw. I wouldn't be surprised if this now became a check raise, but I definitely understand why he doesn't want to be leading when the turn is an ace and the under the gun players very uncapped. So Eddie goes ahead and puts a check raise in, and Pluribus is definitely not going to go anywhere. Then he checks the river when he gets he quote unquote gets there, because now he can still beat some hands, and Pluribus checks. So yeah, I like the way Eddie played his hand, right? Again, context is this should be hopefully balancing some kind of 9x hands, and it's better to check raise this hand if you're doing that than lead on an ace-x board. So I guess if you wanted to lead here, saying that you had if this board was Queen 4-4 and the turn was an ace here, A 4 should probably also be in your check raising range, but you can also like then put like that in your over betting range and lead into the turn, and then like balance that with bluffs as well. So a couple different options of what you can do there against various opponent types. Pluribus gets really frisky under the gun, and this is a hand that you probably can just fold. Mr. Pink checks, Pluribus checks, and Mr. Brown checks with showdown value and a 7. I mean, this is I'm sorry, I got shot. This is a board where if Mr. Brown bet and got check raised, it'd just be a huge disaster for him. And this actually might be a hand that Pluribus check raises like with some tiny frequency, so that's not like a non-zero problem. Pluribus checks, and now definitely Mr. Brown can just go ahead and put in a normal size value bet. And Pluribus immediately puts in the raise. And also, it's like, look at this raise size. It's not even 3x. It's like 2.25. So it's kind of interesting. Like, is this for protection? Is this for like some kind of like weird merge? Right? Like, I mean, it definitely puts Mr. Brown into like a lot of gross spots with, I imagine, a ton of hands that he checked back the flop and now bet the turn with. Right? A ton of hands might just be like, oh, what is going on? So I think he's going to peel with 9s definitely because he can hit a 7 here. But a hand like pocket queens or pocket jacks might now be like in a much more gross spot. So he calls. Now Pluribus checks the river. Mr. Brown checks the river. So whatever this purpose of this check raise was, whether it was for a bluff or whether it was for showdown, by the river now it actually has third pair. It still has showdown value, so it's just going to realize that. Now that doesn't mean it's going to check and then call a bet on the river, but it's going to check here and at least hope that Mr. Brown will also check back, and it must assume that there are enough like kind of like whiffed hands by the river that it can check and hope to win like against like I don't know like ace 3, ace 4, etc. Pluribus opens under the gun, gets flatted, starts with a flop check, and Mr. Blonde bets pretty large. Pluribus calls. Checks, I imagine it's going to be a large bet again. I think for Mr. Blonde's shoes, I would really like making this like 1600 or like 1800. I mean, I think when the board becomes this coordinated, this is going to be one of those spots where overbetting this kind of hand definitely comes into play. Gets called again, and he checks, and then we see just like a fairly normal bet, and I imagine Pluribus is just not going to go anywhere. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think just in general, when your hand is this strong, and your opponent is just taking a passive line, especially when it's under the gun, I would just probably kind of go for a size up and just on every street and just try to get greedy, and mostly focusing on stacking the top of Pluribus's range. Because if I'm betting a very large bet size and my opponent has ace queen or ace king, he's going to be very inelastic depending on at least the flop and turn regardless of what I bet. So I just want to just like really pound it and then put him into like hopefully a really gross spot on the river, especially when the board blanked out, right? Like if this turn is like I don't know the 7 of 7 of diamonds or 7 of clubs, and the river is the 2 of diamonds here, like when your opponent has ace king, like he's going to be able to talk himself into like just a million things missing on the river that you really want to try to put pressure on him for. And so finally, Pluribus opens under the gun, gets flatted by Bud, and gets flatted by Bill. Pretty standard flats from both players. Checks, and Pluribus, goes for the big pot-sized flop bet. Now, this is a super risky bet, especially because, in position, Bud should have all sorts of sets. Bill should have just like a lot of like, low, big blind type hands that are going to be hitting this. So this should definitely be a very rare hand to put in your your flop betting range. But also, like if you're putting this in your flop betting range, I mean, how often should you be betting 650? So this might be a hand that is, one of those rare freak Pluribus hands where it only occurs like 0.03% of the time, as we've seen in some other videos, but definitely surprising to see this bet sizing, and I think it's going to get wrecked, especially when it's facing exactly pocket 5s. So Bud just goes ahead and flats, very incentivized to just flat and just keep in Bill. The turn is the Queen of Spades. Pluribus checks. Bud obviously is going to put in a bet. It's more so a question of what sizing, and so he just puts in half pot, I'm sure that there's a bunch of different bet sizing that work here, so that doesn't, it doesn't really matter too much. Although, I think I prefer something that was a little more geometrically sized to the, to the pot. So like, I think if you bet like 1,500 here, it's just a little bit more of an easier shove than if you bet, like 1,000 here, your opponent calls, it's like 4,000 on the river, and then you're shoving, 2x to get your opponent stacked there. So I'd prefer, probably betting like 1,500 here. Try to maximize as much as you can from like a queen X, aces, kings, jacks, etc. here, and then, get him to fold on the river. Pluribus check raises, because it is just a gangster, I guess. And I mean, what kind of hand is it trying to balance out that pots the flop, checks the turn, and then raises the turn there? Right? So, I mean, this should be representing a extraordinarily narrow part of the range here. Like, I can't even think of, like, what hands you would, like, even make sense here. Right? Like if you had sevens, from a human perspective, you'd never want to just, like, pot the flop, because then you're only going to get really action, from nothing, or, like, 6-4, or only sets, in which you were going to get all the money in anyways. And if you have pocket queens, which, makes a lot of sense to be check-raising the turn, well, you're probably not potting the flop simply because, a lot of the times when you get action, you're going to get action from sets, particularly when Bud's range is going to be much more condensed than yours. So I really don't know what to make of this, but I imagine that Bud should just call to keep in a lot of Pluribus' bluffs, when you're really not sure what your opponent is doing and you think that his line just doesn't make that much sense. You just kind of have to play your nuts type hand passively and just hope your opponent just like shoves off against you. So he calls. I really like this call instead of shoving. And Pluribus ships the river. I mean, I guess if you're going to ship a river when you hold the 8, I mean, this is going to be the river to ship, right? So, this, of all of the lines that Pluribus takes, I like this river shove. But everything else here seems just a little bit, sketch to me. But obviously, this is because I'm evaluating it without being able to see all of the other strategies that are humming underneath and seeing how this is balanced in the very rare times that it, like, pots the flop with pocket sevens. But, like, also, yeah, like, what legitimate hand now also wants to, like, shove this river? I mean, like, I guess pocket sevens is just not going to care and also not going to think that Bud has that many, like, 5-4 type hands. I mean, the 4 should be pretty irrelevant, and, like, Pluribus blocks 8-9 here. But, like, in reality, when you're playing against a human, how many hands do you really expect them to fold here? Especially when you hold spades yourself, right? Especially when you hold the 8 of spades yourself as well. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this. This has, obviously been a very, very long video, and if you have stuck around all the way to the end, thank you so much. And, obviously got to see some really, really interesting stuff to conclude this session. So if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, please write them below in the comment section on YouTube. As always, please like and subscribe, and if you want to support or check out all of the other kind of research and work I've been doing, then check out my own personal website, overnightmonster.com. And happy holidays, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm probably going to be going through a lot more of these kind of Pluribus exploration sessions, particularly because, not only are you seeing how Pluribus plays, but you also get to see how, like, Linus and whoever Mr. Blue and Bud are, and, you get to just learn about how a lot of really, really strong players are playing very, very difficult spots. So, I hope you guys learned a lot from this. I hope that I will be able to keep pressing putting out some of that epic content. I want my free content to be much better than other people's paid content, so that my paid content is just light years ahead of other people's paid content. You know what I mean? So hope you guys enjoyed this. Be well. Peace.